It's all going to be one word. Yes. Tell who the unlucky ones are.
It's my pleasure to introduce Melissa McGinnis this morning. Melissa is the Historic and Cultural Resource Manager for Metro Parks Tacoma, and she's been in that role for the past 8 years. She actually came to Tacoma to manage the Fort Nisqually Living History Museum, and I'm sure many of you have been to that museum, a great resource for Tacoma. Melissa graduated from the University of West Florida with a degree in public history, and she's actually a native of Florida. Can't understand why she would live in this cold, wet, rainy environment, being a native of Florida, but I guess she's seen the light. Obviously, she's lived here for many years now. And she's the author, or co-author, of 3 books, one of which I believe you have a copy of. Yeah. It's specifically on the topic, Point Defiance Park, and 2 others that deal with the history of Tacoma's parks. So she's a great speaker. I've had the pleasure of seeing her in action many, many times, and hopefully you'll all enjoy her talk this morning about Tacoma's Point Defiance Park. Thank you.
Good morning, and actually one of the things about Washington that actually is very similar to Florida is it's very green. It's just all that rain just comes in different ways in different states, in different parts of the state, but the humidity and bug factor here is far superior. I always like to start my talks on Point Defiance Park with this particular quote. It comes from a master plan from the park in 1911 by a company called Hare & Hare. And I think it's as true today as it was 103 years ago that probably no other city in this country has such a beautiful natural park. Its setting and relation to the city are unique and ideal, and every citizen of Tacoma should feel it a duty and a privilege to become one of its guardians. And as citizens, we're its guardians, and as employees of Metro Parks, we're actually thrilled that that is one of our responsibilities is taking care of that park. Let's see if I can figure out which word to point this. Okay, very fancy new system even for the art museum. But one of the first questions people often ask about the park is Point Defiance. Where did that name come from? So I always like to start off with a little bit of background on that. And it's thanks to this man right here. His name is Charles Wilkes. Charles Wilkes was the head of what was called the U.S. Exploring Expedition. It was a naval expedition that traveled around the world, mapping, charting, just everywhere. And when Wilkes got here to the Puget Sound area, he was charting the area. He's most well known for naming Gig Harbor, he named Anderson Island, McNeil Island, and so forth. But when he saw the Narrows and he saw that little, where the bridge is, it is the little narrow spot, this is what he said about it. This narrow pass seems as if intended by nature to afford every means for the defense of Puget Sound. Point Defiance, which he did give it that name, on the east commands all the approaches to it. The Narrows, if strongly fortified, would bid defiance to any attack and guard its entrance against any force. So we became Point Defiance sitting out there. Well, it didn't take the federal government long, but when this report comes back of how important strategically this point of land could be for the military, that President Andrew Johnson in 1866 is the one that designated Point Defiance a federal military reserve. And basically what that means is the land is simply set aside if the U.S. military ever needs it. Now, they never did, but when he did this in 1866, there really wasn't much of a Tacoma at that point in time anyway, so nobody was really fighting for the property. It actually takes until 1873, when the Northern Pacific Railroad announces that Tacoma is going to be the western terminus of their railroad, that things really start to take off around here. That's when Tacoma is established, the railroad comes in, and boy, once the railroad got going, everybody wanted to come to Tacoma. Our population absolutely soared in the 1870s and 80s. And as the population grew away from the downtown, lots of real estate developers and streetcar line builders started pushing further and further away from the downtown core. And there was a group of developers, a couple of folks you may have heard about, Alan C. Mason, Hugh Anderson, Alexander Anderson, excuse me. They really wanted to develop in what's now known as kind of the north end of Tacoma, out by Point Defiance. But they had to build a streetcar line to get you from downtown where your job was out to your new housing area. But they started thinking, you know, that streetcar line really needs a destination because otherwise it's not going to make any money, essentially. If people just ride the streetcar once a day to go back and forth to work, that's not a whole lot of passengers. But if we had a destination at the end of our streetcar line the other way away from the city, well, then that would be something. So it was these real estate developers that got together and sent lobbyists back to Washington, D.C. to try to get Congress to let the city of Tacoma have Point Defiance for a park. Well, they got it through Congress, which is pretty amazing because we're not even a state yet. But when the bill got to President Grover Cleveland, he vetoed it. He said, no, Tacoma can't have it. So they went back again. Mason wrote a check for $500 for a lobbyist to go back and keep fighting, and he did. This time, President Grover Cleveland agreed to the new bill, but it had a caveat in it. Yes, Tacoma, you can use Point Defiance, but you can't own it. If the military ever wants it back, we get it back. That was enough for Tacoma. So Alan C. Mason got busy, and what he did, the first thing they built was a streetcar line. First of all, you got to get people out there. So it was in 1890 that the streetcar line arrived in Point Defiance Park. It was called the Point Defiance Edison line, Edison being South Tacoma, and very proudly announced that it only took 1 hour and 20 minutes on that streetcar to get from Point Defiance to South Tacoma. So if you think traffic's bad today, okay, I just want to go there with that. But something else happened in 1890 in the city government in that now we have this huge of 640 acres out of Point Defiance Park. We've got Wright Park is starting to develop. We've got Ferry Park. We've got Puget Park. The city council goes, boy, we need somebody to look after this. So they appointed a board of park commissioners. Now, this is not like the park board we have today. These were appointed by the city council and given a budget to run the parks. Well, one of the first jobs that city council did was hire these two gentlemen. On the left is Otto Schragel. He was a landscape designer, and it was his job to figure out a layout for this new park. And they also hired Ebenezer Roberts. And Ebenezer Roberts was a well-known gardener. He was working for private homes in the area, and the Park District scooped both of them away to work at Wright Park and Point Defiance. And so Schragel laid out a plan, and it was Ebenezer's job to make it happen. The first thing that they wanted to do was the entry to the park, where that bowl is today, or the fish pond, whatever you want to call it. Well, it was called a cedar swamp in 1890. It was just basically a low spot in the ground where the water drained. And so what they decided, well, let's make it a lake. Let's make it a scenic feature of the park. So they started digging it out, left a little pond in the middle. They actually had fountains in the center of the park. And so the bowl starts to take shape. The other thing that the new park board decided was there was this huge gulch to get from the entry to the park to get back to the forested wooded area. And so in 1892, this most amazing bridge was built. It consisted of 3,500 logs. It was 250 feet long. And if you're trying to figure out where it was located, the bridge, if you're going through Point Defiance Park, you go along 5 Mile Drive and you get to that turn where you take a left to go into the zoo, just past that was the rustic bridge. It has since been filled in. And when I started working here a lot of years ago, I'd see this little sign at this little tiny picnic area called Rustic. And I go, okay, aren't all the picnic areas in Point Defiance kind of rustic? Well, that's what it's named for. That's the location of the rustic bridge. And the rustic bridge existed until the 1930s. At that point, as you can well imagine, it's all wood, just kind of trees stomped on top of each other. Starts to get a little weak in a few areas. And the other thing about it was lots and lots of automobiles are starting to drive through the park. And so the entire gulch was filled and then paved over for a road today. So next time you go by there, just visualize this, because there were so many postcards of that bridge. It was absolutely beautiful. Another early feature of the park is the Rose Garden. In 1895, that man, Ebenezer Roberts, put out a call to the children of Tacoma. And he said, you know, we need roses. This is a perfect place to grow roses. And so he asked the children of Tacoma to please bring cuttings from their parents' yard, with their permission, of course. And before long, Ebenezer had 75 varieties of roses growing in Point Defiance. So that rose garden is one of the oldest in the city. And because Ebenezer was doing just about everything in Point Defiance, he was taking care of the grounds, he was security, he was taking care of the burgeoning zoo collection. The Park District built him that beautiful home in 1898, which still sits in the park. It's designed by C.A. Dahmer, and it was a huge expense for the Park District at the time. It cost $2,200 to build. It was used as the home of the superintendent of parks until 1980, and at that point it was converted to a rental facility, and now it serves as the visitor center for Point Defiance Park. But down to the waterfront, because basically this was the real draw for many, many years in the park. Back in 1895, the park board started offering leases if you wanted to run a fruit stand is what they actually called it. So you could have a concession, they had floats, you could tie your boat up, you could rent boats. And a man by the name of Edwin Ferris just went, wow, there's more business here than I can handle. So in 1903, Edwin Ferris entered into a deal with the park board. He built that beautiful octagonal pavilion on the right-hand side at his own expense. And the deal he made was that he gets to run it for 10 years and keep all the profits. At the end of the 10 years, the building converts to the parks. And so that was the deal that Edwin did. He rented boats. It became the ferry stop in the early years before the ferry landing was established in 1918. Still lots and lots of boats came in. He had a restaurant downstairs serving Mrs. Ferris's world-famous clam chowder, according to the menu, and brought fresh seafood in, and upstairs the Ferrises lived upstairs. So it was a really beautiful spot. But what happened when Ferris built this, suddenly Point Defiance is exploding. Just every weekend, just thousands of people are riding the streetcar down, so they actually had to add a second streetcar line to Point Defiance after the Ferris Boathouse opens because so many people are coming down. But we also started developing other areas. Believe it or not, there was a greenhouse right in the bowl area. The entry to Point Defiance Park was built in 1901. It sat until the 1920s is when it was gone. You can see the interior here. It was the bane of Ebenezer Roberts, even though he was a gardener, because the Parks District wanted it to be not only a display greenhouse or conservatory like we have at Wright Park today, but also propagating. So it wasn't very exciting to see 87 rows of the same petunia that's going to go in every park in Tacoma. And the other one he had this huge frustration with was he had a banana tree that every time it started getting tall, he had to lop the top of it off because it hit the top of the greenhouse. So it didn't work very well for him. Apparently, it also was not a very well-built building. The more I've read about it, apparently because of the moisture inside for the plants, the wood kept rotting everywhere. We were constantly repairing it. And it had a basement underneath it with a wood-fired furnace to keep it warm, which caused a lot of fires over the years. And so by 1920, the greenhouse was gone. And actually, the greenhouse facilities were moved out to where our maintenance area in the park is today. The other structure that is gone from the park that was pretty amazing was called the Narides Baths. Now this was another one of those private-public partnerships. It was built by a private individual in 1906 with an agreement they could run it, keep all the profits for 10 years, and then it converted to the parks to run. The Narides Bath was an indoor, heated, saltwater swimming pool. It pumped up water from the Puget Sound, heated it with a wood-fired furnace down in the basement, and you could go swimming. The one thing about the Narides Bath, though, is that you had to rent a swimsuit. They were wool, one piece, lovely swimsuits that said Narides Baths across the chest. They were just lovely. As we were working on the history of the park, we were not able to find anyone who actually remembered swimming in the Narides Bath, but we talked to a lot of people who were the little brothers and sisters of people who swam. And one lady said all she remembers is her sister, the modesty factor of a wool swimsuit. When you get out of the water, it kind of droops every which way, that everybody was trying to, make everything work. Basically, the Narides fell victim to public health code. As you imagine, not a lot of filtering, not a lot of chlorine pumping up from the salt water, So it closed in 1932 and was torn down. It was designed by Frederick Keefe, by the way, one of our prominent local architects. And let's see what we got going. Oh, the zoo. Can't forget the zoo. You think of Point Defiance Park, and the zoo considers their official beginning to be 1905 because it was in 1905 that the park board voted to spend a sum not to exceed $5,000 in fitting up a proper place in Point Defiance for animals and birds. And so that's when the zoo actually considers their first dates. This bear cage on the left, some of you probably remember if you're a long-time Tacoma residents, it sat where the Wild Wonders area for the zoo is today, their new interactive area right on that curve. I see everybody's hand doing this. Yeah, right on the curve. That's where the bear cage was. Yeah. So this is the bear cage. There's an animal house behind it. And one thing just to point out, if I found the little, there we go. One thing about the zoo, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, is the zoo itself, these are the animal cover areas. The zoo used to go all the way down to the bowl area, you know, that bluff down below the zoo. These were all big grazing areas for deer and we had buffalo in the park at one point in time. And here you can see that greenhouse sitting over in the park at that particular time. And I always like it that the zoo actually started its collections with 2 deer and a possum. So that's how we started, and they grew to the AZA accredited facility that we all know today. Well, something happened in 1907, and that's when the citizens of Tacoma said, you know what, we really like our parks. We don't think our parks are funded well enough. So the state legislature passed a law that allowed cities to vote to establish park districts where there's an independent taxing for your parks, like there are school districts and fire districts. Well, Tacoma holds the honor of being the first official park district in the state of Washington. We were established in 1907. And so once we had that elected board of park commissioners that was their only focus to take care of the parks, they hired a company called Hare and Hare out of Kansas City to design a master plan for Point Defiance Park. What's wonderful about the Hare and Hare master plan is if you look at it closely, we still pretty much work by the 1911 Hare and Hare master plan. They came up with the drive all the way around, you know, 5 Mile Drive as we know it today. They came up with picnic shelters in all these different areas so you'd have little lovely overlooks. They suggested that the zoo pull up away from the bowl area so that the bowl could become more of a dedicated garden space like it is today. They wanted to see improvements. This is the Boathouse Marina area. They thought that should be improved. This is Owen Beach, believe it or not. They really wanted to see a major facility at Owen Beach. But the one thing that really didn't happen so much with them is this is what's commonly referred to as the triangle of the park. This stuff on the other side of the ferry road that's like a big parking lot. You see a lot of boat trailers out there during salmon fishing season, where the old Funland used to be, where the go-karts are located. Hare and Hare had recommended that that become an athletic field with a gymnasium and a pool and all that kind of stuff for the park, and that's the one thing that did not happen out of their plan. But another thing their plan recommended was that all new buildings in the park be built in an Asian style of influence. And so that's why the pagoda looks like the pagoda. That was a Hare and Hare suggestion. They thought that Asian style would be great for the park, low, sturdy, blend into the environment instead of having something really stand out by itself. So the streetcar station, which was changed to officially the pagoda in 1960, was built in 1914. And when you look at it, it's not really a pagoda. For those of you who know Japanese architecture, but you know, in Tacoma, I guess in 1914 we weren't sure. We just knew it was Asian, so we started referring to it as the pagoda. It actually has simply an Asian roof with an arts and crafts bottom, so the bottom actually fits more with the style that we'd expect in 1914, with the Asian roof on top of it. One of my favorite things about it in all the literature, it's referred to simply as the unloading station. Now, I presume if you unload there, you want to load back on. But nonetheless, essentially, as you can see this postcard here on the right-hand side, the streetcar station, actually, the streetcar would stop right in front. You would unload. It pulled around to the side where you loaded. So there we have the streetcar station. The top floor was just simply for creature comforts for people riding the streetcars, and downstairs was a amazing new comfort station or restrooms. There were large restrooms for both men and women with marble dividers between the stalls, tiles on the walls. There was a smoking lounge for men. There was a ladies' lounge for resting. And my favorite part about it is we actually put a small hospital in the bottom, is what they refer to as a first aid hospital. And we had an operating table. We had all the stuff you needed. We ordered all kinds of medical equipment. My favorite park board line is the fact that they actually wrote in the paper that, oh no, we're not going to hire anybody to work down there, because whenever there's a crowd, there's always a doctor. Oh. So, I guess we kind of know those early Good Sam lines. Well, one of the things that happened with that streetcar station, as the park is really starting to explode in popularity. More and more people coming. Edwin Ferris's boathouse is pretty much deemed to be too small to accommodate the needs on the waterfront. So in 1918, the park board hires Russell and Dugan to design a new waterfront boathouse pavilion, and this is what they came up with. Absolutely amazing. This side of, whoops, go back here. This side over here was going to house a restaurant. It was going to house boat storage. It was going to have all kind of the functions of the old boathouse. This was going to be a new near-ease bath, an indoor swimming pool with a dance hall. This big tower was basically just for sightseeing, and in case of an emergency, you can go out and look for a boat if it's out in the water. Just an amazing facility. Well, as Brett, as our CFO, can probably explain, we often don't have all the money we need to embark on these entire great big projects all at one time. So it took us a while, but by 1919, the first floor of the pavilion had been constructed. So we left the Ferris boathouse standing. Here's the first floor of that boathouse. It actually was used as a rental facility for quite a while. There's some great pictures of people having parties and dances up on top of it, and using the bottom part for storage as well. One of the things that took place there just a few years later was a 1924 bathing girl review hosted by the Tacoma Yacht Club. These are the young ladies down here posing in their risque swimsuits and some bare-legged, no stockings. This is a big trend across the country. The Miss America pageant has just started, so we were right in on, hot on the trends. And as you can see from the photograph on the right, just everyone in Tacoma came down to check out the bathing girl review. The boathouse was finally completed in 1926, so you can see it over here on this side. The base that was done first, and then the top two stories, which were made out of wood. And long-term Tacoma folks may remember that the aquarium used to be in this first floor of the boathouse for many, many years. It opened in 1933, but probably the most famous guest is the one that everyone is standing around right now. And anybody know who that might be?
Dub Dub.
Dub Dub. You always have to come audience. They know who Dub Dub was. So Dub Dub the seal was down there on the aquarium for many years. But basically, even though we had great plans to build that huge new beautiful boathouse, this thing called the stock market crash in 1929, the Depression comes along. And so the park system really got a tremendous help from different state and federal work relief organizations, and the WPA, the CCC, and so forth. And basically, there was a CCC camp in Point Defiance Park. Well, back up just a little bit, before this was actually built, in the early years of the Depression, there was no money. Everybody, I mean, there's just nothing. It was horrible. Our recession wasn't good, but that Depression was absolutely horrible. So one of the things the Park Board did was they allowed service groups like Rotary to go into Point Defiance and cut the trees down for firewood. Now, they didn't let you just willy-nilly go cut where you wanted. They cut it on that back side of the park, which is essentially where Fort Nisqually is located today, just above Salmon Beach, Camp 6, that area, was all completely clear-cut by the early 1930s. And actually, youth service groups were so good at cutting down trees, we had to stop that policy. There had been nothing left in Point Defiance Park. But basically, that bluff just above Salmon Beach between Fort Nisqually, looking down the hill, that's where the CCC camp was located. There were 15 buildings down there and barracks for different young men to work in the park. They cleared trails, they built bridges, they built picnic shelters. There's still several WPA picnic shelters left in the park. And you see their evidence just everywhere throughout the whole park system. And one of the big memorials to them is Fort Nisqually. Essentially, like I said, the land was already clear-cut, and in 1932, just a little quickie background on Fort Nisqually, this is not the original location, you've all probably figured that out. Fort Nisqually was actually built down in DuPont, and it was established in 1833 as a Hudson's Bay Company outpost. Well, it was held by the Hudson's Bay Company until they left, a private owner, and then the DuPont Company purchased it in the early 1900s. Well, at that point, there were two original buildings left from old Fort Nisqually, and people kept wanting to go see old Fort Nisqually. But the DuPont Company was making explosives and dynamite down there. That wasn't a good thing. So basically, the DuPont Company put out a word, and they said, you know what? Somebody come get these buildings, or we're just tearing them down. So it was the Young Men's Business Club, a group of the Tacoma Chamber of Commerce, along with the State Historical Society and the Metro Parks Tacoma, got together and they saved the last two buildings of Fort Nisqually and brought them to Point Defiance Park. So those two original buildings from 1850 and 1855 still exist inside Fort Nisqually. But what they did during the Depression is they reconstructed all the missing buildings, the bastions on the corner, the palisades, and all the rest. And in 1934, there was a huge grand opening in downtown Tacoma with parades to come up and see Fort Nisqually. So that was one of the big lasting monuments to all the work that the WPA did in the park. The last big project from the WPA was actually building a new boathouse. So this is that one that was completed in 1926 with the the aquarium down in front. This was the location of that big Ferris octagonal boathouse. But the Ferris boathouse was torn down. It was in pretty rough condition. And this new 1940s boathouse was constructed by the WPA. And as you can see, the Young Men's Business Club used to hold annual water carnivals. It was still an incredibly popular spot for people to visit and enjoy Point Defiance. The last big recession-era addition to the park was Funland, and some of you may remember Funland out in the entrance to the park. Just to get your bearings, this is the Pearl Street entrance right here, and so basically you came right over here to Funland. It was just a huge amusement park with rides and Olaf the Giant, and you could go into the different buildings and see all sorts of stuff. It was a private concern, kind of like the Ferris Boathouse and Arity's Bath. Private individual came in and built it, operated it, and the park district got a cut of the profits. And one of my things I liked about this one, before it opened though, the park board commissioners insisted upon riding each and every ride to make sure it was family friendly. So our commissioners have always been on top of things. And pretty much, the Depression brought a lot of, improvements and different things to the park. Through the 50s, we kind of just eased along. The 60s, there were some other changes to the park. The salmon banks down at Owen Beach. Owen Beach, by the way, named for the longest serving employee of Metro Parks, a man by the name of Floyd Owen, worked for the park district for 47 years. And so that's where that name came from. And I always point out it is Owen. There is no S on the end of it. The Owen family appreciates if you leave the S off. But in 1962, the Seattle World's Fair took place. Well, we in Tacoma, just like anytime something big's going on, well, how do we get them down here? We got to get them down here. Something's got to happen in Tacoma. So basically, that's when the salmon banks started. They were almost a weekly occurrence in the summer of 1962, and they continued for quite a few years into the 70s and 80s, and then just kind of petered out and don't happen anymore at the park. The big change was in 1963 is when the aquarium closes down on the waterfront, and they moved the aquarium up to Point Defiance, up to the zoo, and that's when their name officially changes from the Point Defiance Zoo to Zoo and Aquarium, and where it has been ever since. A couple more things came into the park in the 60s, but both of these occurred in 1964. Camp 6 was a private operation with reconstructed a logging camp, as one would have been built in the woods here in Washington. Camp 6 lasted quite a while, but I'm afraid the recession just did them in. It was a private concern, a small little museum. Most of their collection was sold to a large logging museum in California. Some of it went to Elbe, some of it went to Toppenish. It is still locally, some of it's still in Washington, but the group that owns them also owns the Elbe Train Museum, and they couldn't afford to operate both, so they had to close one. They leased the land from the park district for like $1 a year since 1964. The other one was a completely private concern called Never Never Land. This was a children's amusement park. I'm sure some of you visited Never Never Land over your time. Never Never Land opened to a great acclaim, incredibly popular, incredibly busy. But over time, it just kind of faded in popularity. It was, and I don't know, any of you grew up here, teenagers in Tacoma that went out there and played in your senior year and did not nice things to our figurines and moved them around. That was a very popular thing to do. And to be honest with you, a lot of the stuff that was built was never intended to last that long. And the private individual went out of business in the 80s, and the park district took it over for about 15 years, but then also couldn't make it pencil anymore. So that was the end of Never Never Land, which made a lot of Peter Pan fans not happy anyway, because it's actually Neverland. It's not Never Never Land, but that's okay. Don't want to forget the last boathouse pavilion, because the boathouse, we're working with some consultants right now. They go, wow, there's like, how many boathouses did you have? Well, one of the problems is they're on the water and they're made out of wood, so they fall apart, and there's this thing called fire. Not a good thing. Basically, this is the view that we had after 1940. There's the WPA boathouse. Well, the second boathouse, there was a fire in 1974, and that ended the top 2 stories of that building. Then in 1984, there was a spectacular fire and took out the other half of it. So in 1988, the brand new boathouse pavilion that you see today was constructed. As you can see, the restaurant, which is now Anthony's Restaurant, was kind of built in that octagonal shape to remember the 1903 Ferris boathouse. And if you're ever out there and see kind of a ratty-looking old cement building, what you're seeing is the first floor of that 1919 boathouse that still exists in the parks. So that is still down there today. But I like to wrap up my thoughts about Point Defiance with this line, Tacoma's great pride. Love this picture, and that was a line actually from the newspaper in 1892. That's how much confidence the citizens of Tacoma had that Point Defiance was just the place to be, and we should be amazingly proud. And when you see today how the city grew right up to the boundaries of the park, it really is wonderful that it was set aside way back in 1866 as a reserve, and the citizens in the early days thought that it should be a park, and that, and we have it today to enjoy. So thank you very much.